Okay. Okay, it is 6 o'clock. We have people still coming in, so we're going to give them just a little bit longer.
That's fine.
Make sure everyone's in, and then we'll get going.
That's fine.
Okay. Okay, I think we got everybody in, so I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, and thank you for joining the North Olympic Library System's evening presentation, Mexican to Mexican American, a family immigration story. The North Olympic Library System acknowledges the land on which we live and gather are the appropriated homelands of Indigenous people. We want to express our deepest respect to those peoples past and present, including the Hoh tribe, Jamestown S'Klallam tribe, Lower Elwha Clallam tribe, Makah Indian tribe, Quileute tribe, Quinault Indian Nation, Port Gamble S'Klallam tribe, and the Skokomish tribe for their care of these lands throughout the generation. Let us learn more about the history, cultures, and traditions of Indigenous people. Let us strengthen relationships with sovereign tribal nations to provide an exclusive space, fostering innovation and collaboration at the library. We've have everyone muted, and we ask everyone to turn off their video to help preserve bandwidth while the presentation is going on. For those viewing in Zoom, please watch in speaker view for the best viewing experience. That's up in the right-hand corner of your screen. You can change it from gallery view to speaker view. If you're viewing in Zoom and you have questions, please go ahead and place them in the chat, and we'll get those to Carlos. Let's see, after today's presentation, you will receive a link to the Humanities Washington audience evaluation. Please take some time to fill that out, as they're essential for funding. Also, please go to nols.org to find out about other exciting programs and services the library is offering. The presentation you are about to enjoy is part of the Humanities Washington Speaker Bureau program. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sparking conversation and critical thinking, and it provides many other cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Washington each year. Thanks to support from the National Endowment for Humanities, the Washington Secretary of State, and the Thomas S. Foley Institute of Public Policy and Public Service at Washington State University, and many private donors, Humanities Washington Speaker Bureau presenters visit all corners of the state. I would encourage you to visit their website, www.humanities.org, to find other events like this one. Today's speaker, Carlos Gil, is an emeritus professor of history at the University of Washington, where he has taught the history of Latin America for over 30 years. Before Carlos gets started, I would also like to take a note that the Speaker Bureau program is designed to generate an open and honest conversation on many topics, some of which may be controversial. We encourage differing perspectives and viewpoints, but we also ask that you treat this topic, the speaker, and each other with respect. I hope everyone enjoys tonight's talk, and I'll hand it over to Carlos.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So I'm Carlos Gil, and as you heard, Jennifer, I'm a retired professor of the University of Washington. I taught there for 30 some years, beginning in 1974. and I taught Latin America. We have a very big department of historians at the university, and so we're allowed to specialize. As long as we publish, we're allowed to specialize. And so I specialized in Latin America. But as you'll hear in a minute, my mom and dad and my ancestors came from Mexico. And you will hear this again, 100 years ago. They came 100 years ago. So, so my story then is about them, about my family coming to America, basically to Southern California. And so my plan tonight is to share some thoughts, as you can see here, about Mexican immigration and some related cultural ideas that connect to the topic of immigration, whether it's Mexican or otherwise, doesn't matter. And so that's what I'm going to do tonight. And much of what I'm saying tonight comes from my most recent book. Remember, at the university, you have to publish or you perish. So I didn't perish. And most of my books are in Latin America. This one book that I have here, the last one, is about my folks coming. So it's not Latin America, it's Latin American and American. So in this case, it's Mexican and American. And so the topic is what you see here on the book cover. And so that's me and my brothers and sisters there. We'll come back to them in a few minutes. And those orange groves in the back, by the way, those are there because my dad, coming as he came 100 years ago, he didn't know very much, hadn't studied very much. So he had to work in the citrus groves of Southern California. And that's why I added that photograph, because in the memory, my childhood memory, I can still smell the oranges and the leaves and the perspiration from my dad's clothing when he would come home at night. So I'm not going to do this today, but just to let you know, my book is about my family's leaving Mexico, emigrating from Mexico. They're immigrating to Southern California, are settling there, are taking root there, meaning us kids being born and beginning to, and no longer identifying with Mexico, but identifying with the US and Southern California. And basically, especially the kids, are going from being Mexican to becoming American, but Mexican American, okay? And so that's what the book is about. And as you can see there at the bottom, I came to Seattle when I was 37. I'm 83 now, so that's a long time ago, right? Right. Let me tell you a little bit about how the book came to be, because I think it's relevant. I was studying at UCLA, getting my doctorate degree back in the 1970s. And I took an oral history class and I loved it. And so I began interviewing my old folks. And so I was in my 30s, my old folks were in their 70s, 80s. So I interviewed them all. And so the book that that I just showed you is based on those oral history interviews that I did. That's where that comes from. So I want to share two broad ideas from my book. But first, I want you to meet my family, because the book is about us, about kids and the parents and all that. So here's my family. Over on the left-hand side, holding my eldest sister, Mary, is my father, Bernabe. And then over in the other photograph on the left-hand side is my maternal uncle, Miguel, Mike Miguel. Then my mom dressed in black there. Then my grandma dressed in a gray coat. And then my other maternal uncle, Pascual. So these are our pioneers, right? They're the first people who went to a different country and started out all over again. These are the pioneers. And another thing here. These are these are people who come from very poor backgrounds. I'm going to say this again a little bit later on. So poor they could hardly read. They could hardly write. They couldn't do mathematical formulas, but they had a large degree of their own self-worth. And so on Sundays and on holidays, they would dress up the way you see them there. They look like middle-class people. They weren't. We were not. I can assure you, we were not middle-class people. My grandma, who you see there, she was born 100% Indian in Mexico. A very hard-nosed, severe, hardworking woman. You can tell by looking at her face. So again, these are the larger qualities that are hidden when you interact with a poor person. You never know what that person looks like on Sunday mornings when they go to Mass, right? Or when they go someplace else. So let's go on. Here's my family again, but this is 1949. Most of us had already come on board. And so you can see my dad there. I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but that's my dad. He's hardworking. He's already worn out. He's only 50 years old or so. There's my mom, a more durable woman. My sister Mary, who was a baby in my dad's arms. That's my sister Mary. You can see the names on the side. Her name was Maria de Jesus. She was married to us. And then my older brother Manuel over here. Manuel, Menu. And then Mike, Michael. And then me. Here, look at me, guys. Look at me. And then my sister Martha. And then my brother Rick over here. We had to always be roping him in because he was always astray. And then my sister Sally and Emily. Of these people, only me and my sister Sally and my sister Emily were the only ones alive. Okay, everybody else has gone to meet their maker. So back to my two broad ideas. A look at Mexican migration from our experience in the family and the process of becoming an American, a Mexican American. We're talking about assimilation, really, including some thoughts about generational differences. Those are the two things we're going to look at. Okay. So the first big idea, oh my goodness, there's an overlay of type there. I'll have to fix that later. But my folks immigrated from Mexico, as I told you already. And so there they are, the immigrants. And you can see the years that they came across. Over on the left is my uncle Pascual. He crossed in 1916. Then my dad in 1917. And then my mom and my grandma and my other uncle in 1923. But the bottom note there says that in those years, most Mexicans coming across the border were like my family. They were peasant people, peasant people. If you know something about Poland or Russia or even France or Czechoslovakia, there was peasantry in those countries in the early 1900s. The same with Mexico. So my folks were of that kind of background. Now, the guy on the left over here, the guy who crossed in 1916, here he is at age 23. And I showed his photograph because it demonstrates a guy who has self-confidence. He knows where he is. He knows where he wants to go. Look at his shiny boots. Look at this great hat that he has. And the bottom line on him, because he was kind of the leading pioneer, he refused to become just another peasant. He didn't want to become another peasant. And so he broke away. And to make a long story short, he wound up in California, and then he asked the rest of the family to come along, and they did. So they came across, like you saw earlier, in 1923. So these are the more human dimensions, the more social dimensions, even psychic dimensions of a person that, the census will say he's an impoverished person. But there's more to that, more to that. Okay, here's a map. Here's a map of Mexico, and I'm trying to get you to see where we're from. And so on my dad's side, my father's side, he came from the state of Michoacan, which is right here. And he came from a town called Chavinda. And my mom came from the state of Jalisco, right here. And she came from a town by the name of Mascota, Jalisco. Now, another map. This is a physical map. And what I'm trying to show you here is the range of mountains that come down from the US, and they come all the way down and they meet right here in this kind of a funnel, kind of an end of a funnel here. And this funnel, you find Mexico City, this funnel, the land mass there is an average of 7,000 feet above sea level, okay? Over here, the land masses up here on the northern side, the average land mass sits at about 4,000 to 5,000. So the elevation goes right up. And so when the Spanish first arrived in Mexico through Veracruz, this is where they found the Aztecs and the temples and the aqueducts and the roads and all that marvelous urban architecture of pre-Hispanic Mexico was located right in this area. The rest of Mexico is minus that. My parents were born on the outer edge of that cultural core. And so my grandmother was born, I said, 100% Indian, but she didn't speak Indian. And she didn't eat Indian food. And she didn't dress like an Indian. And why? Because she's out here on the periphery. The periphery becomes Hispanized over a 200-300 year period. And so all those cultural elements begin to fade away. Different had we been down here, down in Oaxaca and Cuernavaca. There we would have spoken some Indian language. Anyway, so that's just to give you sort of a big, broad background on where my family fits in with regard to the larger cultural framework of Mexico. Okay, so down in that core area that I'm identifying, these are the towns that you would see. This is the kind of Indian colonial Spanish architecture that you would find. And again, this is Morelos, farther south, founded 200 years before American independence. So these are the buildings that you would find there. So that's the core, the older core of Mexico. So my folks emigrated from those early years, and I'm going to have to fix that page again. I'm so sorry about that. And so they came in 1916. From 1910 to 1920, my family was in many ways pulled out of its roots, out of its moorings by this event called the Mexican Revolution, 1910. And so the guys that you see here, especially the guy in the middle there, that's Pancho Villa. Everybody knows Pancho Villa. So he was the chief revolt guy, the chief rebel guy of the Mexican Revolution. And I identified here again because my family is uprooted as a result of that. Okay. Now, because the revolution was a workers' revolt, the workers who became soldiers did not have kitchens to go to between battles because they were workers who had revolted. And so here's the people who make up those kitchens, who follow the soldiers in this fabulous photograph here. And so these are the moms, the sisters, the girlfriends, chasing after their worker rebels to feed them a meal before they go to the next battle. Why do I say that? Look at this. My cursor, I hope you can see the cursor right there. That's a basket. Here's a basket. Here's a basket. This is full of baskets. These are the ladies who are ministering to their fighter relatives. Fabulous photograph. Here's some more baskets, but this is a closer shot of these women. They're referred to as soldaderas up here. These are the backup ladies. These are the people who are backing up the rebel soldiers. And there they are. They're holding on to the baskets right there. See that? Yeah. And so this is the kind of stuff that happened in Mexico in the 1910s, 15s, all the way to the 20s. And it included boy fighters like these kids here, okay? Uh, the, uh, the heads of the military groups needed bodies to shoot. And these are young bodies that are shooting. And my uncle at 14, 15 was one of these guys who was shooting because he no longer wanted to become a peasant. So he became a young soldier. And I'm sure he dressed exactly like this. And so our family then traveled. This is our travel route all the way from Jalisco. Here's the state right here. And you can see over here on the side, the major stops were Puerto Vallarta right here. Down at the bottom here, where's my pointer? Then they went by boat to Mazatlan right here. And then by train all the way to Nogales. And then they crossed over. And then they met in Fresno. And then finally settled in San Fernando. Okay. So from Mascota, Jalisco to San Fernando. San Fernando is my hometown. So my parents finally settled in San Fernando, and we, the kids, then started to come. And so this is an early photograph of San Fernando. And so let's see, how do I go back? Mija, Solana, I'm gonna go on. Solana, hold on. Solana, And so I'm going to go on with my talk here. Here, hold on. I get the screen back. The screen went down and I don't know how to bring it back. Huh? So I want it back up, big, full. There you go. No, and then back up to there. Is that it? And I think that's it right there. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, folks, but I'm working on my granddaughter's laptop, and it's an Apple laptop, and I don't know how to use Apples. So if you don't know where my hometown is, it's right there where the dark arrow shows up, where all the freeways in Los Angeles come together. If you're going north, no matter what freeway you're on, you have to pass through my hometown. Anyway, so beyond my family, one of the key ideas that I'm trying to get across here in this talk, since the talk is about Mexican immigration. Beyond my family, this image here summarizes what we know about migration. And so these are the factors in the migration of people. And they can be sorted out into pushing factors and pulling factors. And you can see here that the pushing factors include political factors like political instability, overthrows of government. They can include persecution. They can include economic instability, the lack of jobs, war, hurricanes. All those are pushing factors, including personal reasons too. Like in my family, my folks wanted to be with my brother who had gone ahead. So in many ways, my family illustrates this idea because they were pushed by political instability. They were pushed by persecution, lack of jobs, and personal reasons at the same time. And they were pulled in a certain direction. And that's one of the main ideas here too. By the same factors, jobs, political refuge or perceived political refuge, personal connections, and family. Now, in the Mexican case, we have this special factor that operated for 30 years at least. And you can see that down at the bottom there, the job agents. At the job agents, here's a great photograph of a job agent. And the job agents were these guys who were representing a company, a farm, a railroad company, a cooperative of farmers, and they were sending their guys, their representatives, down to the Mexican border in the teens, 20s, 30s, and 40s, all the way to the 50s. This is a photograph from 55 or so. And so what's this guy doing at the border? He's signing up workers. And the workers have just crossed the border. Look at them, look at them. Look at the workers. Look at those huaraches and the hats and genuine workers of Mexico of that period. And they're signing up because they want a job. And the guy says, of course you have a job. We'll take you there. Those are the job agents who became critical factors in bringing workers to employers in Western US. And that included my uncle, my mom, my grandma, all of my ancestors, when they reached the borders, they were, you could almost say they were accosted by a job agent who said, "Do you want a job? I'll sign you up right now, and I'll have you sent to the job within 12 hours. That's the job agent. That's the beginning connection between the Mexican economy and the American economy. And it begins very early. So all those factors that I'm talking about are summarized in these numbers. So here you have numbers that reflect the Mexican population in the US between 1910 and 1930. And you can see that the bars just grow right up from 10, 20, 30. And if you look more carefully at the numbers, you'll see that the numbers are sorted out according to state. So you'll notice that California and Texas have the highest numbers. See at the very end here, by 1930, California has 191,000 and Texas has 262,000 persons who at a census event said, yes, I was born in Mexico. These are Mexican born census data from the years that I'm showing, okay? So that shows you basically waves of people coming through. And these are only the people who are accounted for by census employees, okay? And the distribution of these folks is in many ways highlighted here by my blue arrows. So again, the idea is that the fatter arrows, the bigger arrows, are headed to California, just like my parents. And the other one is going to Texas. And the thinner arrows are going to either Arizona or New Mexico. New Mexico has the thinnest arrows. What's the difference? Why is it? Economic development is the broadest answer to the question. California and Texas were developing more strongly with greater dynamism, and they were needing workers from 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And keep an eye on that arrow to Texas. Look at that arrow to Texas. We live in Washington State. So Mexicans arriving in Eastern Washington during and after World War II came from Texas. And they came in that direction, right through there, all the way through up into Eastern Washington. And they were coming through there because they were harvesting sugar beets. That's what brought them all the way into Eastern Washington, the famous betabel in Spanish, okay? And so that explains why we have in Eastern Washington, we have very, very sizable Mexican communities because they're the immigrants or the children of immigrants or the grandchildren of immigrants who came following the sugar beets after World War II. UNI means Utah and Idaho sugar. And so these families that I'm talking about stopped in Utah, they stopped in Idaho to harvest sugar beets, covered it into pure, fine, granulated sugar. I don't think you see this brand anymore. And I'm so sorry, this screen is upside down. You're gonna have to bear with me. If we could turn it around, you'd see that there's a map of those states that I'm showing you. And there's a license plates that were donated to a new museum in Seattle about 2 years ago when it opened up. And these are families that followed the migrant trail up into Eastern Washington. I had to redo my slides, and I'm so sorry that they're appearing this way. I'm so sorry about that. So, so again, if you move your head to one side there, I'm sorry about that. These are the shacks. These are the housings that were available for the farm workers as they were traveling up from Texas into Eastern Washington. And as you can see up on top, one of these informants said we were unprepared for the dust and cold. Yes, absolutely. No doubt about that at all. So I'm saying that in my case, my ancestors were part of these early population waves. And so about 2 years ago, I created a blog, and the name of the blog is up there, Pensamientos Over the Border by me. And so I was basically reminding my family, my nephews and so on, that we've been around for 100 years. Yeah? And so have many, many, many other Mexican American families. The other idea that I'm trying to get across here is that in addition to migration, it's that idea of the job agent, the idea of economic integration between the US and Mexico. Mexicans crossing the border in the 1940s, 50s. And over here on the side, you can see on the side, I make reference to the Bracero program. And that's a program that encouraged, in many ways, strongly encouraged Mexican workers, like the guys you saw earlier in that big photograph. And here you see them massing up at the border. It strongly encouraged Mexican workers to come across the border and harvest our fruits and vegetables while our able-bodied men and women took part in World War II. And that explains the years on the Bracero program. It begins in 42 when we went to war against Europe, against Germany and Japan. And it ends in 64. But this is a huge stimulus of this cross-border relationship that in many ways has not died down to this day. And it's stimulated by these very important moments in historical time. And so again, this basically restates what I'm saying. The Bracero program encouraged Mexican laborers to bring in our harvest while our American men and women aided the war effort. So these guys here did this so that these guys here could do this. The same here. So the ladies could now go to factories, leave their home behind, and like Rosie the Riveter, go do and take part in the war. So these are important linkages that make the relationship between the US and Mexico a very special relationship. We do not have that relationship with any other country. Here's a great photograph that I took from the museum. I'm glad it's not over to the side. And these are Bracero labor camps near Wenatchee in the 1940s. Great photograph taken from the Seymour Museum of Chicano Latino Culture. Look at that fabulous photograph. I have to include NAFTA here. NAFTA was a very controversial program in 1994. And I use it here because I see it as a capping stone to the economic integration of the US and the Mexican economies. Why is it a capping stone? It's a free trade agreement. And the free trade agreement removed barriers to products going back and forth across the border. If you can see here on the side, on the left side, these are things that we export to Mexico today. All those items Mexico buys from us. And over here on the right-hand side, these are what we buy from Mexico, all the way from vehicles and TV screens, monitors, crude oil, medical, all the way down to fresh fruits, avocados and mangoes and all that. So this exchange is a powerful factor in bringing people back and forth across the border. You can't have trade between two countries without having people cross the borders as well. You can't do that. And so this is my main argument here. This is the main argument that I have in this first part of my talk. Our economy has worked like a magnet in Mexico. And these loose particles that have been flown through the air and stick to the magnet are the Mexicans who weren't fully connected to the Mexican economy because they didn't have enough schooling, they weren't of the right color of skin, all those factors that are part of humanity. And so our magnet brought them in, and they explain why it is that we have somewhere between 8 million and more American residents of Mexican background who have been here 20, 30 years with children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, already Americans like me and my children. This explains it, folks. This explains it. So, economics can drive migration? Of course it can. Of course it can. The second idea is the idea of becoming a Mexican American. I'm going to have to fix these slides, guys. I'm so sorry. So the idea here is if you cross the border, and especially if you're a full-blooded Mexican, whatever that might be, you won't look like everybody else. You're going to be identified right away. So you fall into the bin of the hyphenateds, right? Why should I let these freak voters cast whole ballots when they're only half Americans, right? That's part of the immigration story in America and everywhere else, folks. All immigrants are perceived, almost all immigrants are perceived as different. Almost all. We know that. And Americans can be sorted into generations, even though some of us don't know anymore what generation we belong to. But most of us can be sorted out into generations. In my book, the first generation are the folks who crossed the border, the ones I showed you earlier. The second generation in my book is me and my brothers and sisters and my cousins. The third is my kids and their cousins. And the fourth are my grandchildren and their cousins. And I discuss all these generations in my book, by the way. And the main point that I'm making here is that the first generation sets the tone, culturally speaking. Why? Because they load up their bags with all the back home culture they can, and they bring those bags across the border. Every migrating population does that. What if you and I were beamed into China? Beam me up, Scotty. Would we want to hold on to who we were in dress? Would we immediately change dress? Would we immediately take the Chinese language as ours, Chinese food, of course we would. And that happens to every migrating group that goes from one place to another. The first generation has a hardest time fitting in. And we have to keep that in mind when we talk about immigrants, especially nowadays, that we seem to refer to them in a very disparaging way. Italians did this in Boston. They held on to who they were. If you go to old Boston, you'll run into Italian Americans celebrating the Santa Maria di Anziano on June 5th and the San Anthony of Padua on June 12th, and so on and so on. That's because the first generation sets the tone, and the second and third generation more or less follows along, more or less. The Koreans did the same thing in Los Angeles. The Vietnamese did the same thing in Los Angeles. The Mexicans have done that in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in San Antonio, in Yakima. The Germans in Wisconsin, even with their cannibal sandwiches where they eat raw meat. All that is part of the culture that you pack into your bags. My mother had all these photographs on her walls, icons of the cultural values that she held, beginning with the Virgin of Guadalupe there and so on. Look at my grandma walking around carrying saintly figures around her neck, okay? What can you do? That's the way things are. In our case, in my book, holding on to who we were brought us problems because the moral codes were different between the culture of my immigrant folks and the culture to where we wound up in Southern California. What am I talking about? Moral codes? The rules about a person's behavior vis-a-vis other people, vis-a-vis God, the supernatural. More specifically, it meant respect for the elders, total obedience to the elders, strict rules about behavior for girls, issues of chastity, issues of conservative speech, issues of dress. Can we stay overnight? No, you can't. Those are cultural values that are brought over by the first generation, and they hit the fan when they come to the US. They did in our case. My siblings were wounded. Here are their words. Grandma would never whip me like my mom did just because she felt like it. I was never allowed to have friends. They were always checking on me. I never dressed like a modern girl. We kids were torn between my mom's version of Mexican culture at home and the American culture that washed around us. Between hamburgers and tacos, you could say. How could you resist them? We Gill kids in particular, different from other Mexican American families. We learned both cultures. Some Mexican families learn only one, but we did both. And so here's one set of cultural heroes: Bing Crosby, Hopalong Cassidy, Doris Day, Snow White, peanut butter and jelly, all that stuff we had to learn, but we had two sets of values. And so here's the second set down at the bottom. Pedro Infante, Pedro Armendariz, Maria Félix. We had those two sets. And so we were different. And so how did we Gill children differ from our immigrant fathers? We differed religiously. We differed language-wise. We differed in terms of our relations to our mother country. We differed in the way we worked, and so on. How did we, the Gill descendants, compare to the immigrant first generation? Well, here are the 5 bags full of culture that my answers filled up and brought across the border. And here, me and my brothers and sisters, we got rid of 2 bags. And then my son and his siblings and cousins, they got rid of another bag. And so over here, you see my grandsons upside down. They are holding on to the straps of their bags. No longer the full 5 bags. And that's the major argument that I'm making, that assimilation is a transgeneral process, and it is a complex process as it is personal. And it does not happen in one generation. Which generation are you, and what do you think of the cultural baggage idea? Do you have any questions? Any questions? Sorry about the upside down photographs.
I haven't seen any questions come in chat, but anybody who would like to ask a question, please feel free to unmute yourself, and you can ask Carlos yourself. Also, you can turn on your video if you would like, and we can have more of a discussion.
I'll be happy to answer any questions or any comments. I see somebody waving her hand there.
Yes, go ahead, Sally. You're on mute.
I can't. I think she's muted.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, she unmuted me. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay.
I was wondering when you talk about second generation and third generation and your grandchildren, do you ever have family conversations about the immigration and how immigration is spoken of today in America? And, you know, like, I mean, it just seems like it would be such a difficult situation for people to have been here 100 years as a family, and still strangers look at you and say, oh, you're new, you're from Mexico, why are you here? I just wonder about the whole sort of family dynamic of conversation.
Well, yes, yes. We do talk about it in different ways with different intensities, depending on who the person is. In the case of my children, they're already in their 50s, are pretty well read. They know how things are going in many ways. And so they already know in many ways what's going on, especially these last 4 years that we went through that experience. And then I was referring to my granddaughter. She's younger, of course, has a more limited experience, but she already knows, she already indirectly, not always specifically with certain words, but indirectly is very aware of the differences, of the culture clashes, if you want, that are associated with immigration. And we talk about it all the time, especially in my house. And so my family, and I think in many ways, my nephews who live down in Southern California and in Texas, I think they're aware, although they may not always crisply tell you in so many words, but I think there were, and they don't always agree with the same intensity. I would say that we have some pretty conservative-minded folks, even among our extended family, but they're not the kind of ideas or arguments that you would hear from maybe somebody out of Iowa or out of Oklahoma or someplace. A little bit different, but yes, the answer is generally yes, yes.
Okay, it looks like we had a few more questions come in. Lucy asked, did your grandparents become US citizens?
Good question. Good question. My mother became a US citizen when she was in her 50s. My father died at 57 and he did not become a citizen. And my uncle died at 88. He did not become a citizen. Of course, his reading and writing was very elementary too. I think that's a factor. And my other uncle, he became a citizen in his 60s and 70s. So it varies a lot depending on, remember that one of the big factors here is schooling. How much schooling for the early immigrants coming in through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. It's very different now from the immigrants that are crossing the border with documents or without documents. Now they have a very different kind of schooling background. So it differs a lot.
Okay, and then we have another one. Are people coming across the border today for different reasons?
My general answer, even if we include the Central Americans, because my discussion has been mostly about Mexicans.
Mhm.
And so in general, I'm making that the Mexicans have a very different experience and relationship with the US. Central Americans are different altogether. But still, in the end, if you look at the factors that push them out, they fit right into what I was saying earlier. Political persecution, political instability, victims of hurricanes, all those are factors that are pushing them out. Now, the pulling factors may be not as precise as with the Mexicans, because the Mexicans have had relationships with their employers over generations. The Central Americans have not. They have a shorter relationship, so their pulling factors are a little bit different. But good question.
Okay, looks like someone mentioned your story reminds me so much of Victor the Senior as written in Reign of Gold. I have read that book several times. Are you familiar with his book?
Oh yes, very familiar. It's one of the best stories that there is an existing field of literature called Mexican American literature, and so his book is at the top. Yes,
Okay.
and there are many other books that fall into that framework too. It's a very similar framework. Yeah.
Okay. And it looks like we have, Michelle said, our fourth generation Mexican family members are most educated and made the transition from labor like work to mental high paid work. But these young people are also the ones wanting to understand their heritage and want to embrace their heritage. Is this true in your family?
It's true, but more with some and less in others. And so it depends in many ways on the parents, depends on where they grew up, the education of the parents as well. So it's a mix, but in our family, we have that according to family lines, I would say. Some family lines show it more than others.
Awesome. Okay, does anybody else have any questions or comments? Again, you're free to unmute yourselves and ask your question yourself if you would like.
And I apologize profusely for the upside down photographs. I'm going to fix them right now. I redid my stack and I didn't follow up as with as much detail as I should have.
That's fine.
Sorry about that.
That's perfectly fine. It was a great presentation. I thank you very much for your time. I think
Thank you.
everybody is all finished, so
And,
we'll go ahead
and again, Jennifer, I congratulate you for the work that you're doing.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I will see you tomorrow.
You will.
Yeah.
I'll fix my
Okay, great.
stack.
Awesome. Great.
Thank you.
Oh, Michelle.
Yeah.
She's waving by.
Oh, okay.
Great. Thank you again, everybody. Have a great night.